And this is the word of the Lord. Hello, mustard seed. It's been 2 months. It's the longest I've ever gone, I think, without preaching. I missed you too. It's nice to be back to some life-giving rhythms again. One of the tangential fruits of the past few months, as my daughter Wei has recovered physically from her stroke, is that, and we've all gone through the shock and fear of that unexpected event, things have found a new relative importance for me. Many things that preoccupied me during most of 2023 have completely receded from my awareness, while other things that I had perhaps been overlooking have come into very sharp and stark focus for me. And I see something of this dynamic at work in Jesus' divine authority. His teaching and his life bring into focus what is most important. The things that the culture may have overlooked or has decided are not so important, or in fact, in some cases, even feel threatened by. Jesus taught with authority. His teaching was challenging. It always had a kind of unavoidable challenge in it. It wasn't merely insightful. It wasn't of interest to hear. Jesus' teaching did not tickle the ears. So much of what gets presented as teaching or informing us today, it functions much more like a form of distraction or entertainment, I reckon. We're always gathering new tidbits of information. We like to pick things up here and there. But as a general rule, people and cultures are not hungry for deeper insight that would reconfigure the way we do life. Mostly we just want to get by, right? Life is tough enough as it is. We want to have a good day, to be relatively untroubled by deprivation or violence or unpleasant weather. It's enough for us to enjoy our friends and avoid our enemies, to achieve our goals and to escape feeling being a failure. And the teaching Jesus presents does not send us on our way to enjoy our day untroubled. No. Jesus' teaching troubles his listeners. And not in a conventional argy-bargy difference of opinion kind of way. Jesus' teaching the way Jesus taught challenged the very foundations of the society's assumptions regarding what is most important. Not just an interesting alternative, it's a deeply confronting shining of the light on the very roots of humanity's beliefs about ourselves. And the evidence of this can be seen in that if the teachings of Jesus were merely a fascinating alternative, they would be considered and then adopted or laid aside like so many other teachings before and since. But the teachings of Jesus do not really make space for such a benign option. The culture tends to be either persuaded of Jesus' truth and authority, or it has a kind of compulsion to silence that voice altogether. And part of the issue here, of course, is that Jesus was a thoroughly authentic teacher. He lived his convictions. People who encountered Jesus were challenged just as much by who he was in their midst as anything he actually said. And to silence his teachings meant you would need to rub out the man. And there's no judicial process known to humanity that could have legitimately found Jesus guilty of any offence against the people. Jesus manifestly loved and cared for all who came into his orbit, and the people generally knew that. Any prosecutorial conviction would require a fairly careful and elaborate stitch-up. There would need to be an insider, you might call him Judas, who could manipulate things in the way that needed to go. Confected testimony would have to be concocted. The timing would be essential, kind of like the dead of night just before a major holiday, something like that. You know how politicians release really unpleasant stories just before the grand final weekend or something like that. it would never have been sufficient for those who opposed Jesus to merely win a theological debate, and they made many attempts and weren't able to do so. But even if they managed to get the upper hand theoretically, Jesus' life remained more eloquent than the strongest argument. He lived his authority. His life revealed the authenticity of his teaching, and this authenticity added to Jesus' authority. And perhaps even more notable was the way Jesus' teaching resonated in the hearts of people. People got what Jesus was saying almost in spite of themselves. See, we human beings are very clever and quite tactical about what we allow into our consciousness. For example, I don't much like horror movies. Some people like them, I don't like them. Quite apart from the lack of any enjoyment in deliberately subjecting myself to the experience of unnecessary fear, horror movies tend to too fluidly meld with my dream life, and then they start to disrupt my sleep as well. So you know what? I don't watch them. Now, there's something of an analogous dynamic at work when people withdraw into their particular echo chambers, I think. You know, we don't like that point of view. We prefer that way of seeing things. We find this more affirming, that kind of stuff. And my point here is not to comment on the dangers or the benefits of sticking with what we prefer. It's simply to recognise that this is a sensible thing that most of us do by default every day. We need a good reason to choose discomfort, and for everything else we don't choose, we default to whatever is most convenient or comfortable. And Jesus had this way of telling stories that people enjoyed listening to, and they identified themselves in the story. And then, just as they were getting caught up with the drama of the narrative, they found themselves deeply disturbed by the point of the story. Disturbed not because the story didn't work somehow, disturbed because the stories Jesus told laid bare hidden truths in the listener that the listener would prefer remained hidden even from themselves. I suspect this is how we should understand the dynamic of demons outing themselves in Jesus' presence. When Jesus calls out and challenges oppressive things that have become such a familiar part of the way we do things, so that it's even how we see ourselves in a sense, those things within us will reflexively react. And there can be a paroxysm of violence even against those who threaten the status quo. But Jesus' authority was very clear. The truth that he told with authority was clear. It wasn't vague. Precious little wriggle room when Jesus' audience arrived at the point of one of his stories. It was near impossible to miss his points. Jesus co-opted culturally familiar characters and tropes and crafted these into devastatingly clear and life-confronting truth. You might remember that Jesus told a story of day labourers in Matthew chapter 20. They were being hired in the town square. This was a situation that his audience would have been completely familiar with, just like they'd see it every day on the street. And some of the people in the story worked all day, and some of them only worked for the final hour of the day. And again, people would have been very familiar with that kind of reality. The startling part of Jesus' story was, at the end of the day, they all got paid the same full day's wage. And you could feel the outrage in the listeners. They think, that's not fair. And yet, no one was hard done by. Rather, some received significantly more generosity from the hand of the vineyard owner, and it was clear that the vineyard owner was within his rights to be as generous as he wanted to be to whoever he wanted to be generous to, and yet something within us feels that's not fair. The elements of this story of Jesus and the way that he put them together makes the truth of the grace of God confrontingly and inescapably clear. It's not fair, but that's not about fairness. Jesus could be very definitive as well. He entered everyday situations and brought truth to bear with devastating effect. In John chapter 9, there's a story of a woman caught in adultery. Again, not an uncommon situation in those days. The people knew what to do in response to this situation. They were probably both literally and metaphorically, gathering their stones for the official sanctioned judgment of this woman caught in adultery. And they asked Jesus about this judgment, and they felt so sure they were about to trap him. And Jesus does not challenge what the legislation required. Instead, he challenges those gathered regarding their suitability to carry it out. Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone. And the people were left in no doubt that they were not qualified to pass judgment on each other. And while Jesus did teach with lots of parables that were stories and this kind of thing, sometimes he was really unambiguous, and particularly punishingly unambiguous when he spoke about the religious leaders. Matthew chapter 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." A metaphor about which none of his first century audience would have been left confused. A potent image. Tombs filled with the bones of the dead were ritually unclean. So these apparently snow-pure, righteous people were concealing their hearts that were just deception and uncleanness. But the most threatening aspect of the authority of Jesus, I think, is that it alters our perceptions of things. Now, this is particularly threatening for those who are comfortable with the status quo. Matters that had only ever been understood in a particular way began to be seen in a new and compelling light as Jesus taught. This kind of disruption can be exhilarating if you're looking for things to shift, but it can also be profoundly disturbing and threatening if you're happy with the way things are. And that might explain why those on the fringes of the society of the day had precious little to lose from the recalibration of how things worked, and they liked Jesus a lot more than those who were in positions of comfort and power in the existing structure, who obviously had a lot more at stake. In John chapter 9, there's a story of the man born blind, a miracle that was a healing that was worth celebrating by any who cared about the well-being of the people. And yet in that story, the religious authorities are utterly caught up with the fact that Jesus performed this life-giving miracle on the Sabbath. And later in another place, Jesus kind of frames that to help people understand what he's doing. And he talks about if an animal falls into a ditch and it needs to be pulled out, you pull the animal out, whether it's the Sabbath or not, for the well-being of the animal. But how much more would you do that for people who need to be cared for? So he was just caring for people. And the power of Jesus' authority exposed the deception that was going on so often. Despite the obvious power Jesus had at his disposal, there's no indication that he used that power to manipulate or coerce. Rather, in all that he did, Jesus brought to light reality that was already there for the seeing. And this is an interesting point. People just left to their own devices didn't seem to have the wherewithal to assemble the available data in a way that allowed them to see clearly. And I'm reminded of a certain point in history here where before this certain point in history, everybody agreed together that the Earth was the centre of reality and all the planets and the stars moved around the Earth. That's how we understood it, apparently. And then this guy, Copernicus, by the clever use of measurements and mathematics, worked out that the available data made much more sense if we understood everything to be revolving around not the Earth, but the sun. Now, Copernicus didn't see more. He saw exactly the same stuff. He just saw it differently, and it made more sense. Jesus was not deceived or blinded by the weight of overwhelming unanimity regarding the way society and even God must be. He mostly gently and carefully, and sometimes abruptly and with passion, expose the hypocrisy of the status quo. Jesus was not thereby attempting to establish an alternate part truth. Sometimes we of his followers forget this, but he was interested in allowing the fullness of truth to be seen and lived. You might remember that one of Jesus' self-identifiers in John chapter 14 is, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And later on in John 18, "You say correctly that I am a king, for this I have been born, and it is for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Jesus lived this powerful and life-transforming truth. The most stunning impact of Jesus' teaching and truth is its power to bring to birth entirely new life-giving ways that people can be together. Jesus' teaching and interaction with the people, his life, his death, his resurrection, so significantly altered the people's sense of reality that they were no longer defined nor confined by what had previously been established as unassailable. Entirely new ways become not merely possible, new ways become obvious and compelling. Rather than remaining focused on the survival and the security imperatives of themselves and their immediate family, Christian communities soon developed a far broader sense of the meaning of well-being. The power of Jesus' authority brought about free, genuine, desirous, and lasting change in the very hearts of the people. This salt, leaven, and light, which are the kind of metaphors that Jesus used, have been at work in the culture of every society that has been touched by the gospel. And they're metaphors that speak of the transforming power of this authority. It suggests a change in the hearts of the people and the nature of whole communities, cultures and societies. And we've seen that for 2,000 years. Jesus' commitment to love, truth and life reveals to us how we can be the best kinds of humans. It almost never means going with the flow. It nearly always involves clear-minded, deliberate choices made in response to the call of divine authority. Now, if you're familiar with Jesus' divine authority, you will know it is neither manipulative nor coercive. It is neither the power of deception nor the power of intimidation. Jesus' divine authority is the power of compelling truth that transforms the hearts of the people. Rather than offering us everything our hearts already desire, Jesus offers to reconfigure how desire functions in our heart so that we genuinely desire that which is good and true, and that is always attainable only by faithfulness. This will radically recast the relative importance of everything, and it will cast out the destructive demons we harbour within ourselves. Are we willing to draw near and allow Jesus' divine authority to do its saving work in us? Come, let us prepare ourselves to gather at his table and see what he will do. Let us pray. Lord, your divine authority, your teaching, your truth, your power is life-giving. Have your life-giving way with us, that we might bring life to the world. In your name, amen.